When four homeless little girls are thrown out of his luxury hotel, one look into their eyes forces a ruthless billionaire to confront the past he's been running from, and a future he never saw coming. Before we get started, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from so we can say hello to you. Now, on to the story. In the heart of Chicago, 46-year-old billionaire Jonathan Hayes stood tall in the grand lobby of his hotel chain's flagship location. The towering glass windows reflected the shimmering sunlight, casting a glow over the sleek marble floors beneath his polished leather shoes. To the world, Jonathan was the embodiment of success. His life, meticulously mapped out in 15-minute increments, revolved around business meetings, investment returns, and the power he wielded over his empire. Emotions had no place in his world, and everything. Jonathan's arrival that morning was part of his usual routine, one he called his field efficiency inspection. It was nothing more than a formality, but his employees knew the stakes. They knew that the smallest mistake could result in wrath. So when Jonathan stepped out of his sleek black car, dressed in his signature navy suit, white shirt, and tie, his mere presence was enough to put the entire staff on edge. They snapped to attention, smoothing creases in their uniforms and offering stiff smiles as he walked past, his eyes cold and calculating. As he moved through the lobby, a strange sight stopped him dead in his tracks. Near the revolving doors, there was a commotion, a security guard shouting, his arm raised, gesturing sharply toward the street. And standing right there, in front of the hotel, were four young girls. They were barely waist-high, dressed in simple, faded cotton dresses. Each girl wore a different pastel color, soft pink, pale yellow, sky blue, and lavender. Their blonde hair was tousled and wild, blown by the wind. Their faces were pale, smeared with exhaustion, or perhaps something more painful, fear. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. The girls were small, fragile, and alone. They huddled together, clinging to one another with an unspoken bond. One clutched a frayed stuffed animal, while another held her sister's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. The guard looked ready to push them out onto the streets, dismissing them like unwanted baggage. But something about their stillness, something in the quiet desperation in their eyes, made Jonathan stop. For the first time in years, the cold walls of control that he'd carefully built around his heart began to crack. Without thinking, he walked forward, his voice steady but with a hint of something softer beneath it. "What's going on here?" he asked the guard. The words were clipped, but there was an urgency in them. The guard hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the sudden attention from the hotel's owner. And as Jonathan crouched down to their level, his eyes locked with theirs, the world around him seemed to disappear. "Where is your home?" he asked gently, his heart racing. And it was then that everything changed. Jonathan Hayes had always believed in precision. Every aspect of his life, from the way he dressed to how he ran his billion-dollar empire, was meticulously planned. As the CEO of a luxury hotel chain, he commanded respect with just a glance, his every move a testament to control and dominance. The world moved on his terms, and he liked it that way. But today, as he arrived unannounced at one of his flagship hotels in downtown Chicago, something felt different, something he couldn't quite name. The early morning sun reflected off the hotel's glass facade, casting sharp reflections across the polished marble floors of the lobby. As always, Jonathan's arrival was met with hurried gestures from the staff, who straightened up as though to become a part of the immovable structure that was his presence. He walked through the lobby with purposeful steps, his sharp gaze cutting through the polished surroundings. The employees, dressed in immaculate uniforms, exchanged tense glances. Everyone knew the drill: when Jonathan was on the premises, nothing could be out of place. It was all about perfection. Today was no different, at least, that's what Jonathan thought. But as he crossed the lobby toward the front desk, something unusual caught his attention. There was a disturbance near the revolving doors, a commotion that rippled through the otherwise calm morning. A security guard stood with his back to the door, waving his arms in irritation as he shouted at someone, or perhaps something. Curiosity pricked at Jonathan's ever-composed exterior, and he slowed his steps, eyes narrowing. The guard's voice became clearer, sharp and demanding, as he pointed toward the street, his posture rigid with authority. And then, Jonathan saw them. 4 little girls, barely taller than the guard's waist, stood together, seemingly caught in a world far too big and hostile for them. Each girl wore a faded dress in a different color, soft pink, pale yellow, sky blue, and lavender. Their hair was a tangle of wind-blown strands, and their faces, flushed from exhaustion or fear, Jonathan couldn't tell, told a story he wasn't ready to hear. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with authority. The guard hesitated for a moment before responding, his voice unyielding. "They've been sitting in the lobby for hours," the guard said. "No adult, no reservation. They don't belong here." Jonathan's eyes shifted from the guard to the girls. Something in their silence, the way they huddled close together as though bracing against an unseen force, made his chest tighten. His mind raced, but his voice remained steady. "Let them stay," he said, his words cutting through the tension. Without a second thought, he knelt down to their level, not just out of courtesy, but something deeper. He needed to know more. The girl in blue, she seemed the oldest, looked up at him, her eyes large and too mature for someone so young. "Where is your home?" he asked gently. For a long moment, there was nothing but the silence between them. And then, in a voice so quiet it almost didn't seem to exist, she said, "We don't have one." Those words, simple yet loaded with a pain he couldn't have anticipated, hit Jonathan harder than any business failure ever could. His mind tried to process what his heart couldn't comprehend. 4 little girls, abandoned, alone, right outside his luxury hotel. They didn't belong here, yet somehow, it was he who felt out of place. The sun had just started to glint off the hotel's sleek, mirrored glass walls, signaling the start of another day in his meticulously scheduled life. But today, as he approached the revolving doors, he saw a commotion at the entrance that immediately interrupted his usual routine. A hotel security guard was waving his arms, his voice sharp with frustration, as he shouted at a small cluster of figures standing near the doors. As Jonathan neared, he saw what had caught the guard's attention: 4 little girls. They were barely reaching the height of the guard's waist, and their appearance was jarring against the backdrop of the polished luxury that surrounded them. The girls were dressed in worn cotton dresses, each a different pastel shade: faded pink, pale yellow, soft blue, and lavender. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were wide with exhaustion or fear, Jonathan couldn't tell which. Their hair was wild, tangled from the wind, and their small hands clutched whatever little comfort they could find. One of the girls held onto a frayed stuffed animal, while another gripped her sister's hand so tightly that her knuckles were white with strain. The security guard was clearly impatient, his frustration boiling over as he pointed toward the street, ready to shove them out the door. Jonathan's instincts kicked in. This was his hotel, his establishment, and no one, not even a guard, would treat people like this, especially not children. His expression hardened, and without a second thought, he stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. Jonathan ignored the guard and crouched down, lowering himself to the girl's level. His gaze swept over their frail forms, their silence hanging heavy in the air. His heart clenched with an unfamiliar urgency. He wasn't a man who typically showed vulnerability or empathy, but something in the way these children stood, huddled together like a small, fragile unit, struck him deeply. With a voice softer than usual, Jonathan asked, "Where is your home?" The girl in the blue dress, the oldest of the group, looked up at him. Her brown eyes were far too serious for her young age, and after a moment of hesitation, she answered quietly, "We don't have one." The words seemed to echo around Jonathan like a thunderclap. His mind raced to process what he had just heard. 4 little girls, alone, homeless, abandoned, standing at the front door of his luxury hotel, a place meant to offer comfort and safety. The world seemed to pause as he processed the weight of their situation, the surrealness of it all. Jonathan Hayes had seen many things in his life, but nothing prepared him for the sight that unfolded before him. As he stepped closer to the revolving doors, he saw 4 little girls, barely reaching the height of a grown man's waist. Their faces were a patchwork of exhaustion and fear, their clothes ragged, the delicate pastel hues of their dresses faded and torn from wear. Each girl held on to the other in a tight, protective huddle, as if they were the last pieces of safety in a world that had offered them none. The youngest, with wild, tangled brown hair, clutched a stuffed bear that looked nearly as worn as she did. The others, their faces flushed from the cold, clung to one another with an intensity that spoke of their shared hardship. Emma, the smallest, had tears in her wide brown eyes, though they didn't fall. She had learned, like the others, that showing weakness was dangerous. Clara, the oldest, stood slightly in front of the others, her shoulders squared as if she were the one protecting them, despite her own fragility. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as the hotel security guard barked at the girls, his tone sharp, dismissive. The man pointed toward the street, clearly trying to push them out. "No adults, no reservations," the guard said, his words cold as he motioned them away like unwanted strays. The girls stood unmoving, their faces drawn with a mixture of confusion and fear, but they didn't speak. They didn't protest. They simply stood together, awaiting whatever came next. Without a second thought, Jonathan stepped forward, his usually composed demeanor shaken by the helplessness in the girl's eyes. His voice, though calm, carried an authority that made the guard pause. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze never leaving the girls. The guard, taken aback, fumbled for words. "They've been sitting in the lobby for hours. They don't belong here. I was told to clear the space." His eyes darted nervously, but Jonathan barely acknowledged him, instead crouching down to the girl's level. His gaze softened as he met Clara's eyes, the brown depths holding an unspoken sadness that Jonathan could feel in his bones. "Where is your home?" he asked quietly. Clara hesitated, the words taking a long time to form. Then, with a tiny shake of her head, she whispered, "We don't have one." The words hit Jonathan like a thunderclap. 4 little girls, alone in the world, abandoned and forgotten. And they were standing in front of his hotel, in a place built to shine, but now, they were the shadows. His heart ached as he stood up, the weight of the situation sinking in. He glanced over at the front desk, where no one seemed to notice the girl's plight, and then back at them. Without another word, he turned to the guard. "They're coming with me." Jonathan Hayes had never been one to show emotion in public. His life, built on precision and control, didn't allow for moments of hesitation. Yet, as he approached the commotion near the revolving doors, something in his chest tightened. He had been to countless hotels, seen all kinds of situations, but this was different. The security guard's voice was sharp, scolding the 4 little girls who stood frozen, clutching each other. He was pointing toward the street, ready to shove them out of the hotel like they were no more than trash to be discarded. But Jonathan's eyes were locked on them. The girls, barely half the size of the guard, looked out of place in the luxury of his hotel. Their tattered dresses, frayed at the edges and faded from wear, were like a cruel contrast to the marble floors and sparkling glass around them. Jonathan's usual impassive expression faltered for the briefest moment as he looked at the girls. Their blonde hair, wild from the wind, their cheeks flushed from exhaustion or fear, he couldn't quite tell which, pulled at something inside him. One girl clutched a stuffed animal, the other gripped her sister's hand so tightly their knuckles turned white. The youngest, her face pale and wide-eyed, stood motionless, her body trembling just slightly. Without thinking, Jonathan stepped forward, cutting off the guard's harsh words. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, too calm for the storm that was brewing inside him. The guard hesitated, eyes darting nervously before he stood a little straighter. "They've been sitting here for hours, sir. No adult, no reservation. I was told to clear the space." Jonathan ignored him, crouching down to meet the girl's eyes. He had never bent for anyone before, certainly not for children, but something about these girls made him pause. There was a stillness to them, a quiet resignation that spoke volumes. They were alone. They didn't belong, at least not here, not in this perfect world of his. Jonathan's voice softened, betraying a hint of uncertainty he rarely allowed. "Where is your home?" The girl in the blue dress, the oldest, looked up at him, her big brown eyes surprisingly steady for her age. She didn't answer right away, as if weighing whether to trust him with the truth. Then, with the smallest shake of her head, she whispered, "We don't have one." The words landed with a gut punch. For little girls, standing in front of his hotel, homeless, abandoned. And yet, in this moment, Jonathan was the one who felt lost. Jonathan crouched down, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked into Clara's brown eyes. There was a quiet gravity in her gaze, something that made him pause, something that felt far too old for a child her age. For a long moment, the girl didn't speak. The silence between them was deafening, the weight of his question heavy in the air. Finally, with a slow shake of her head, Clara's voice cut through the stillness, soft but steady. "We don't have one." The words hit him like a blow to the stomach. Jonathan blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just been told. For little girls, standing in the cold in front of his hotel, had no home. No place to go. No safety. His mind tried to reject the truth, as if it didn't belong in the world he knew, one where money and power solved everything, where control was the one constant. But the haunting simplicity of her words stuck with him, settling deep in his chest. Jonathan's eyes shifted to the other girls. They were still huddled together, looking up at him with wide eyes, eyes that seemed far too wise for their tender age. Emma, the youngest, was clutching her stuffed bear with both hands, her grip tightening as if afraid it might slip away. Sophie, in the pink dress, held on to Grace's hand so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Their faces were pale, their bodies thin and frail, as if they hadn't seen the comfort of a real meal in days. Jonathan stood up slowly, the reality of the situation sinking in. The lobby around him, with its polished marble floors and gleaming chandeliers, felt suddenly cold, sterile, and empty. No one was paying attention. The front desk staff was oblivious to the girl's plight, continuing to check in guests without a second glance at the scene unfolding before them. Without thinking, Jonathan turned to the security guard, his voice low but firm. "They're coming with me." The guard blinked, clearly confused. "Sir." But Jonathan didn't wait for an explanation. He motioned for the girls to follow him, and with a slight hesitation, they did. Their footsteps echoed softly as they walked behind him, the sound of their tiny feet out of place in the grand lobby. And in that moment, Jonathan realized that his life, his empire, his success, meant nothing if he couldn't find it in himself to help these girls who had nowhere to go. Jonathan Hayes had never been one to waver, especially in moments of crisis. He'd built his empire with ruthless efficiency, making quick, calculated decisions that had kept him at the top. But when he saw the four little girls huddled together in the corner of his hotel lobby, something inside him stirred that he couldn't ignore. The sight of them, frightened, hungry, abandoned, tore through the rigid walls he had so carefully constructed around his life. For a moment, his sharp mind tried to compartmentalize the situation, to analyze it with the cold precision he was known for. The staff, the security, the rules, everything should have been going according to plan. But this was different. These were children, and they were sitting right there in the grand lobby of his hotel, clutching onto each other as if they were each other's last anchor in the world. Jonathan could feel the eyes of the other guests on him, the murmurs of confusion and judgment. They were all wondering why someone like him, a man who controlled millions of dollars, who had the world at his fingertips, would ever stop to look at a few homeless children. But Jonathan didn't care. He didn't care about the whispers or the stares. His gaze was fixed on the girls, each of them so small and fragile, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. One of them, a little girl in a pink dress, was clinging to a stuffed bear, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Another girl, with wide blue eyes, was holding onto her sister's hand like it was the only thing keeping her from falling into the abyss. And the youngest, no older than 5, kept glancing up at him, her curiosity mixed with a quiet sadness he couldn't quite comprehend. Jonathan's chest tightened. These girls, abandoned by the very world that should have protected them, had nowhere to go. No one was looking out for them. It wasn't just a charity case, it was a responsibility. His responsibility. Without thinking, his voice came out firm, but surprisingly gentle. "They're coming with me," he ordered the security guard, who blinked in confusion, unable to understand the change in his demeanor. As the girls followed him in silence, Jonathan's mind raced. He had just made a choice that would alter the course of his life forever. The room fell into a heavy silence as the 4 girls sat together, hunched over the sandwiches Jonathan had ordered. Their tiny hands shook slightly as they tore at the bread, their hungry eyes barely leaving the food. The way they ate, devouring every last crumb, told Jonathan everything he needed to know. These girls hadn't tasted a meal like this in days, perhaps even longer. The sandwiches were gone in minutes, the water bottles emptied just as quickly. Still, none of them spoke. Jonathan watched them with a mix of disbelief and guilt. In his world, food was a given, always available, always plentiful. He'd never known hunger like this. He had never known what it was like to eat, not for pleasure, but out of sheer necessity. He had never had to fight for his next meal, and yet here they were, 4 little girls who had been abandoned, left to fend for themselves, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the desperate bond between them to keep them going. Emma, the youngest, caught Jonathan's eye for the first time since they had entered the lobby. She was sitting closest to him, eyes wide and filled with curiosity. She kept looking up at his watch, at his tie, at the way he sat, as if trying to understand the man who had just swept them into his care. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. The others, Sophie in pink, Grace in yellow, and Clara in blue, stayed quieter. They were protective of each other, moving as a unit, their faces drawn and cautious. Jonathan could see the way they held each other, the unspoken rules of survival that ran deeper than their years. The silence was thick with the weight of their lives, lives that had been changed in ways he could barely comprehend. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say to them? How could he fix their broken world? After a long pause, he finally spoke. "Where is your mother?" His voice was gentle, though he was afraid of what he might hear. Clara looked up from her food, her brown eyes steady, her voice soft. "She's in the hospital. She had an accident. She's been there for days." The words hung in the air, a cold, painful reality that Jonathan wasn't prepared for. The mother of these children, Sarah, was someone he hadn't seen in 6 years. He hadn't known she had children, let alone that she was lying in a hospital, unconscious and alone. The weight of the realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. These girls, his daughters, had been left to survive without anyone. He felt something stir in his chest, a mixture of guilt and something deeper he couldn't quite name. Jonathan stayed silent as they finished eating. Jonathan's heart clenched as Clara's words sank in. "She's in the hospital. She had an accident. She's been there for days." The sentence, spoken with a hollow tone, seemed to freeze the air around them. Jonathan, who had built his empire with razor-sharp focus and precision, now felt a crack in the foundation of his carefully structured life. His thoughts raced. Sarah Roberts, the woman he had once loved, had been lying unconscious in a hospital for days, and her daughters, his daughters, were left to fend for themselves. The reality of the situation hit him like a wave. He hadn't seen Sarah in 6 years. Their parting had been messy, filled with words left unsaid and promises broken. Jonathan had chosen ambition, and Sarah had chosen a different path, one that seemed more grounded, more real. But he had never forgotten her, nor had he ever fully closed the door they once shared. He had buried the memory of her with success and power, telling himself that it was better that way. Now, standing before him, were the very daughters he never knew existed. Their mother was lying in a hospital bed, alone, fighting for her life, and he had no idea why she hadn't called him, why she hadn't reached out. Clara, the oldest, stared at him with wide, brown eyes that seemed too old for her young face. Her gaze was a mixture of pain and resolve, like she had long since given up expecting anyone to help. And yet, there she was, asking him for something he didn't know how to give. Jonathan's fingers clenched into fists. He couldn't look away from her, the smallest of the four, yet carrying the weight of the world in her tiny hands. He felt the enormity of the decision ahead of him, but in that moment, it didn't feel like a choice. He had no idea what he was doing, no experience to draw from, but he couldn't leave them like this. With a deep breath, Jonathan finally spoke, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "You're not going anywhere until we figure this out," he said, his words surprising even himself. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about stock prices or business deals. He was thinking about these four little girls, abandoned and alone, and for the first time, he realized just how broken the world around him had become. Jonathan's heart raced as Clara's words settled over him like a cold wave. "She's in the hospital. She had an accident. She's been there for days." For a brief, surreal moment, he couldn't breathe. His mind struggled to process what she had just said, but the truth hit him hard: Sarah Roberts. The name, once so familiar, now carried the weight of years gone by. He remembered the woman he had once loved, the one who had stepped away from his life as he became consumed by ambition. The one he had never reached out to, never thought to look for. 6 years. That was how long it had been since they parted ways. Back then, they'd had different paths to follow. He had pursued wealth, control, and power while she sought a quieter life, one outside the frantic pace he had set. He'd moved on, focusing on building his empire, convinced that love was nothing but a distraction. But now, as he stared at the four small, fragile figures in front of him, the truth was undeniable. They were his daughters, the children he never knew existed. The thought of them alone in a hospital room, abandoned by the one person who should have been there for them, shattered something inside him. His mind flashed back to Sarah, her warm smile, the promise they once made to build a life together. But he hadn't kept that promise. He hadn't been there when she needed him. And now, her daughters were here, standing in front of him, looking at him like they knew exactly what had been missing in his life. Jonathan felt a sinking feeling in his chest. Why hadn't he known about them sooner? Was it too late to make up for the years lost? The guilt that churned within him made it hard to focus. He should have been there, he should have known. But as the truth settled in, he also realized something: this was his chance to do what he should have done all those years ago: protect them. He took a deep breath, swallowing the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He stood up, wiped the sting of regret from his eyes, and looked at the four girls, each one so vulnerable, yet holding an unspoken strength in the way they huddled together. They needed him now. And this time, he wasn't going to walk away. As the girls stepped into the suite, their eyes widened with uncertainty, but there was a flicker of something else: hope. Hope that had been buried beneath the weight of their silence and pain for so long. Jonathan watched them, his heart heavy with the realization that these children, these fragile souls, were now his responsibility. The lavish suite, which had always been a symbol of his wealth and success, felt foreign now. The marble floors and gold accents seemed to mock him as he stood there, torn between the man he once was and the one he was becoming. He walked over to the window and looked out over the city, but it felt distant, almost unrecognizable. It wasn't the first time he'd questioned his life choices, but it was the first time that questioning felt urgent, pressing. For so long, he had prided himself on his ability to control everything, from his empire to his emotions. But now, as he turned around to face the 4 little girls sitting on the plush furniture, his world had shifted in a way he couldn't comprehend. "I'll make sure you're safe," he said softly, though the words felt strange in his mouth, unfamiliar. He wasn't used to making promises, especially ones that he couldn't easily fulfill with a check or a well-executed business deal. But in that moment, he realized that his wealth meant nothing if he couldn't provide the one thing these girls needed most: stability. They had been abandoned, left to fend for themselves in a world that had been so unkind, and Jonathan wasn't going to let that continue. He motioned for them to sit at the small table by the window, where he had ordered room service to bring a small feast: sandwiches, fresh fruit, and milk. The girls hesitated at first, still uncertain whether they were allowed to eat, but Jonathan's calm presence reassured them. As they settled into the warmth of the suite, he watched them with a new intensity, a deep understanding that he had never had before. These girls, with their small hands and wide eyes, needed him, not as a businessman, but as someone who could protect them from a world that had already tried to break them. For the first time in his life, Jonathan didn't think about quarterly goals or investment returns. His mind was focused entirely on these girls. He wasn't their savior, but in this moment, he vowed to be something just as important: their protector. That night, Jonathan found himself sitting outside the suite, his back against the cold marble walls of the hotel corridor. The muffled sound of laughter and soft voices from the room inside reminded him of how foreign this entire experience had become. He had built his empire on control, on meticulously planned strategies that involved no room for emotion, no space for disruption. And yet, here he was, his mind no longer occupied with financial reports or the rising stock market. Instead, he was consumed with the 4 little girls who had turned his world upside down. The quiet girl, Clara, with her serious brown eyes; Emma, who had looked at him like she was trying to understand the stranger who had offered them a safe place; and the 2 younger girls, who had barely spoken but whose faces held a vulnerability he had never expected to see in children. They were still so small, yet they carried the weight of an entire world in their tired eyes. He could feel it in the air, their sadness, their confusion, the deep loneliness they'd carried with them since the moment they'd been abandoned by the one person they trusted. For the first time in years, Jonathan was not thinking about the next deal, the next business expansion, or the endless meetings. He was thinking about them, these girls who had no home, no real place to go, and yet, somehow, had found their way into his life. He leaned his head back against the wall, running his fingers through his hair in a rare moment of vulnerability. It felt strange, not the usual weight of responsibility he had felt in his luxurious office or even his penthouse. This felt different. This felt like it mattered. He glanced at the door again, hearing the soft murmur of voices from within. They were safe, for now. But he knew, deep down, that he couldn't just let them go back into the world they had come from. Not after everything he had witnessed. These girls, his responsibility now, had taught him something he never thought he would learn: what it meant to truly be needed, to truly make a difference in someone's life. And as he sat there, the weight of their trust in him sinking in, he realized that he no longer cared about power or control. What mattered now was their well-being, their future. And for the first time, Jonathan Hayes understood what it meant to be a protector. The sun had barely risen, but Jonathan Hayes was already in the hotel's kitchen, clumsily attempting to make breakfast for the girls. The scent of burnt toast filled the air, mingling with the occasional hiss of the frying pan as he scrambled eggs. His movements were awkward, unfamiliar with this kind of simple task. It was a far cry from board meetings and financial strategies, but somehow, it felt right. As he worked, he couldn't shake the image of the girls from his mind. Their faces, so full of silent resilience, haunted him. Clara's quiet strength, Emma's innocent curiosity, Grace's tender protectiveness over her sisters, each of them was a story he had yet to fully understand, but one that was already deeply etched in his heart. The youngest, Lily, had a small grin plastered on her face as she peered into the kitchen, her wide brown eyes sparkling with curiosity. She watched him with the kind of wonder reserved for those who had never had someone take the time to care. "Mr. Hayes," she said with a shy giggle, "you're doing it wrong." Jonathan laughed softly, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. "I know, sweetheart. I'm no chef, that's for sure," he replied, ruffling her hair. The girls settled around the small table, their tiny hands reaching for the food that Jonathan had so painstakingly prepared. Clara, always the oldest and most cautious, checked the toast with a skeptical eye before nibbling on the edge. Emma, on the other hand, dug in with unabashed hunger, her face lighting up with every bite, as if this was the first meal she'd ever been offered without strings attached. Jonathan watched them, his heart swelling. It wasn't the perfection of the breakfast that moved him, it was the trust in their eyes, the way they accepted him into their lives without question. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't seeing numbers or profits, he was seeing people. His heart, once closed off to the idea of love and connection, was slowly being opened. It felt like he was being reborn into a new life, a life where the laughter of children and the simple act of being present mattered more than any business deal he had ever closed. For the first time in years, Jonathan Hayes wasn't just a man of wealth and control, he was becoming a father, a protector, someone they could trust. And that realization struck him harder than any stock market crash ever had. The quiet hum of the hospital echoed in the sterile halls as Jonathan led the girls toward the ICU. Each step seemed heavier than the last. He could feel the weight of the situation settling deeper into his chest. The girls, who had so recently been strangers in his life, now clung to him like he was their only lifeline. He didn't know how, but in just a few days, they had become his world. As they approached the ICU, Clara, the oldest, squeezed his hand tighter. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. Emma, the youngest, tugged on the hem of his jacket, her face a mixture of curiosity and fear. Jonathan couldn't imagine what it must be like for them. To have your world turned upside down, not knowing what the next moment would bring. When they entered the waiting area, the atmosphere was colder, more sterile than the warmth of their hotel suite. The nurses offered them a polite smile, but the sadness in their eyes told Jonathan that the situation was dire. They led the girls to a bench, and Jonathan took a seat next to them. His mind raced, trying to understand how it had come to this. They had come to see Sarah, the woman from his past, the one he thought he'd forgotten. The one he never expected to see again, not like this. He hadn't even known about her accident. 6 years ago, their lives had diverged, and now, she was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. He spoke briefly with the doctor, who confirmed that Sarah was stable but still unconscious. "She's fighting," the doctor said softly. "But it's going to take time." Jonathan nodded, absorbing the news. It wasn't just her physical recovery that he was concerned about. It was the past, the years they had lost. The questions that would remain unanswered until Sarah woke up. Would she recognize him? Would she be angry with him for not reaching out? As he returned to the waiting area, Clara was the first to speak. "Is she awake?" Her voice trembled, the hope in her eyes almost too much to bear. Jonathan hesitated. "Not yet, but she's getting better. She'll wake up soon, I promise." The moment he spoke, Emma's hand slid into his. It was a quiet, simple gesture, but it was everything. In that moment, he wasn't just a man taking care of 4 little girls. He was their protector, their hope, and for the first time in his life, he felt a deep connection to something more than just his own ambition. Jonathan sat in his hotel office, staring at the file of paperwork that had been placed in front of him. It was all so unfamiliar, this world of child custody, social workers, and emergency care. He ran his hand through his hair, his mind swirling with thoughts of the 4 little girls and their mother, Sarah. He couldn't shake the image of them, huddled together in his hotel lobby, their eyes filled with hope and fear. He had known Sarah once, long ago, and now here were her daughters, abandoned and waiting for a miracle. The weight of the decision he was about to make pressed heavily on his chest. For the first time in years, he was making a choice that didn't involve profit margins or quarterly goals. He was making a decision for them, for those girls who had no one else but him now. He couldn't ignore the bond that had formed between them in such a short time. They had grown to trust him, even if he didn't fully understand why. Jonathan picked up his phone, the screen lighting up with the contact information of the social worker he had been given. His finger hovered over the number, his mind racing. What if they didn't approve of him? What if they thought he was unfit, just a wealthy man trying to play hero? He couldn't afford to lose this chance to make a difference in their lives. With a deep breath, he dialed the number. The social worker, a woman named Rachel, answered on the second ring. Jonathan's voice was steady as he explained the situation, how he had found the girls abandoned outside his hotel, how he had brought them into his care. He could hear the skepticism in Rachel's voice, the doubt that clouded her response. "Mr. Hayes, this is unusual. You're a businessman, not a guardian." Her words stung, but he pushed forward, his determination hardening. "I can provide for them. I can give them safety, stability. I may not be their father, but I will do what it takes." His words hung in the air, raw and honest. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice softening. "I'll make sure the paperwork gets pushed through faster. You'll need to be patient, but it's a start." As the call ended, Jonathan sat back in his chair, the reality of the situation sinking in. He was taking on a responsibility he had never imagined. But as he thought about the girls, their faces, the way they had quietly accepted him, he knew there was no turning back. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was their protector now, and he would fight to give them the life they deserved. The days blurred into one another as Jonathan settled into an unexpected rhythm. What had begun as a duty, taking responsibility for the 4 little girls, had slowly morphed into something else. A week ago, he had been a man whose life was neatly compartmentalized: business, success, control. Now, his mornings began with the sounds of children's laughter, the rush of tiny feet padding down hotel hallways, and the weight of responsibility pressing down on him in ways he had never imagined. He watched as the girls adjusted to their new, temporary life. Emma, Clara, and Lily had begun to fill the space with their presence, their voices echoing through the suite. Grace, always the quiet one, was the most tentative, her eyes always searching for reassurance, her movements more deliberate than the others. But even she couldn't deny the warmth that was beginning to take root in this strange, luxurious place that had once felt like nothing more than a stopgap for his work. Jonathan had never been one to give much thought to anyone else's needs. He had built his empire by shutting off emotions, by focusing solely on outcomes. But now, he found himself waking up at dawn, not for a meeting or an investment opportunity, but to make breakfast. His hands, usually steady in the boardroom, fumbled with eggs and toast, trying to get everything just right for the girls. The first attempts were disastrous: burned toast, eggs that were too runny, but he didn't mind. The girls were gracious, even when the pancakes were a bit too thick, when the syrup spilled everywhere. It was all so foreign to him, this vulnerability, this constant need to be present. At night, as they all sat together on the floor of the suite, surrounded by crayon drawings and stuffed animals, Jonathan realized how much he had changed. The quiet hum of the city outside no longer consumed him. The only thing that mattered now was the soft sound of their breath, the weight of their small bodies curled up next to him, seeking comfort. It was then, as Grace leaned against his shoulder, that he wasn't just providing for them. He was learning how to feel again. And it was terrifying. He had been so sure that control was the key to everything. But with these girls, he found himself powerless, and yet, for the first time, he felt whole. The balance of his life was shifting. It wasn't about wealth anymore, it was about something much deeper, something he had never known he was missing. Jonathan had always believed that control was the key to success. For years, his life had been a series of perfectly executed moves, meetings, mergers, and meticulous planning. Money was the language he spoke, and power was his currency. But as he stood in the quiet hotel suite, watching the girls play with their crayons and stuffed animals, something inside him shifted. It was a subtle change at first, like a crack in a foundation, barely noticeable. But every time he looked at Clara, Emma, Grace, and Lily, something in him softened. The chaos they brought into the room, the laughter, the endless questions, the spills and smudges on the carpet, felt so different from the sterile order he had always maintained. And yet, it felt right. The first time he heard Lily hum while skipping through the hallway, his heart twisted. It was a melody he hadn't known he was missing, and for the first time, he felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest, a weight that wasn't related to business or profits, but to the undeniable sense of responsibility for these children. They had become his world, and he had never expected it to happen. As the days passed, the girls began to trust him, their shy smiles and hesitant glances replaced with laughter and joy. They no longer looked at him like a stranger, they saw him as someone who would listen, who would stay. And for Jonathan, the transformation was just as profound. He had never imagined being needed in this way. He had spent years building an empire, thinking that success was about conquering the world. But here, in this suite, surrounded by these 4 little girls, he was learning what it meant to be a protector, a father figure, something he hadn't thought he could be. His mind would still wander to business sometimes, to the meetings he'd missed, the reports that piled up on his desk, but now, the weight of the missed calls felt less important. What mattered now was their safety, their happiness. As much as he tried to push the thoughts of his old life away, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for these girls, for showing him that the most valuable thing he could have wasn't a stock portfolio, it was the quiet, unspoken love they gave him every single day. In their presence, he began to realize that maybe, just maybe, the control he'd spent his whole life perfecting wasn't the answer after all. It was love, vulnerability, and letting go that made him truly feel alive. Jonathan had never imagined his life would lead to this, sitting in a hospital room, holding the hand of a woman he had once loved, surrounded by 4 young girls who had unexpectedly become his world. The soft beeping of machines and the scent of antiseptic faded into the background as Sarah's tired eyes met his, filled with both confusion and gratitude. She had asked him, her voice hoarse from the effects of the trauma, "Why are you here?" The question was simple, but it cut through the air with raw vulnerability. Jonathan paused for a moment, his mind racing through the tangled web of his past decisions, regrets, and newfound responsibilities. He had been a man who believed in control, in maintaining distance from anything that might disrupt his perfectly structured world. But now, there was no denying it. "Because I didn't know they existed," he answered, his voice surprisingly steady. "And once I did, I couldn't not be." The words felt heavier than he had expected, a raw admission that he had never been prepared to make. Sarah's eyes welled with tears, and for the first time, Jonathan saw something beyond the bitterness of their past, the recognition of what could be, of what might have been if only he had stepped up sooner. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing the tears to slip down her cheeks. "I didn't want to interrupt your life," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought maybe it was better this way." Jonathan's heart clenched, and he leaned forward, holding her hand a little tighter. "Better for who?" he asked softly. "For me, maybe. But not for them. And not for you." The words hung between them like a heavy silence. In that moment, he realized how much he had taken for granted all these years, the things he had missed out on, the love he had denied himself. And now, as he sat in this hospital room with Sarah, he knew that his life had irrevocably changed. She smiled weakly, her fingers brushing against his. "You stayed," she said, the words carrying more weight than she could have known. "Every day," Jonathan replied quietly. He didn't need to say anything more. What had started as a duty had now become something he couldn't walk away from. This was his family. And no matter what came next, he was staying for them. After weeks of living in the hotel suite, surrounded by the noise of business and temporary comforts, Jonathan knew it was time for something permanent. The four little girls, once shy and withdrawn, had started to leave their mark on every corner of the suite, drawings taped to walls, crumpled stuffed animals on the sofa, toys scattered around the floor. They had transformed the space from a cold, impersonal place into something that felt like a home. One evening, as he watched the girls playing with their stuffed animals on the floor, he felt the weight of the decision that had been looming over him. He needed to find them a real home, something with walls that weren't just for protection, but for warmth. He knew it had to be a place where they could grow, a place where their laughter would echo long after the last toy was put away. He started looking, not just at houses, but at the spaces where they could be themselves, where their personalities could bloom. When they walked into the house, it was immediately clear to him that this was where they belonged. It wasn't the grandest place, nor the most expensive. The rooms were modest, but they had charm. There was a big backyard, a space for the girls to run freely and for their imaginations to take flight. It wasn't a mansion, it was a home. The moment the girls ran through the door, their eyes wide with excitement, Jonathan felt something inside him stir. Emma, ever the thoughtful one, immediately declared it smelled like cinnamon. Sophie found a nook by the window and began imagining it as her new reading spot. Grace rushed to the backyard, screaming with delight at the sight of grass beneath her feet. And Lily, sweet Lily, sat on the floor, clutching her stuffed bunny and whispering to herself, "It's better here." Jonathan could feel his heart swell as the girls filled the house with their energy. This place wasn't just walls and a roof, it was a future. It was theirs. As they moved in, Jonathan carried boxes, hung up crayon-drawn pictures, and set up nightlights in each room. For the first time in a long while, he was doing something that mattered more than business deals and board meetings. He was building a life with them, one step at a time. This was his new purpose, a life filled not with deadlines and profits, but with laughter, love, and the promise of family. The morning of the girls' 6th birthday dawned quietly, with soft sunlight spilling through the windows of their new home. Jonathan Hayes stood barefoot in the kitchen, wearing a faded t-shirt, carefully lighting 6 little candles on 3 small cakes. The aroma of vanilla and strawberries filled the air, mixing with the faint chill of the early morning. Outside, the sky was still dark, but soon it would bathe the house in warmth. Sarah joined him a few minutes later, her hair still tousled from sleep, her eyes warm but tired. She leaned against the counter, watching Jonathan as he balanced the candles, his fingers deft and careful despite the lack of sleep. The house, though simple, felt alive with possibility. It wasn't much, but to Jonathan, it was everything. He never imagined his life would turn out like this, not with children, not with this kind of peace. And yet, here they were. The moment the girls appeared at the top of the stairs, still in their pajamas, the excitement in their eyes was unmistakable. Clara, the oldest, was the first to squeal, followed by Emma, Sophie, and finally, little Lily, who jumped up and down, clapping her hands. The birthday cakes, one for each pair of twins, stood ready, the flickering candles catching the light from the windows. Jonathan smiled, kneeling beside them as they made their wishes with all the sincerity that only children could muster. Their little faces, full of joy and wonder, brought a lump to his throat. He didn't need to ask for anything more. This moment, this family, was the greatest gift he could have ever received. As the candles were blown out, Sarah kissed each of their foreheads, her smile more genuine than Jonathan had ever seen. It was a smile of gratitude, of hope, and of love that she never thought she would find again. The girls scattered off to play, their laughter filling the house as Jonathan and Sarah stood side by side, watching them with a quiet sense of contentment. Later that afternoon, they would celebrate with a small party in the backyard. But for now, it was just the 6 of them, quiet, peaceful, and full of promise. As Jonathan watched the girls running through the yard, he knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't just giving them a home. They had given him one too. And with that, he realized, this was only the beginning. We'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and rate this story from 10 to 100. Tell us where you're watching from too. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if this touched your heart, check out more uplifting videos by clicking on the end screen now.